So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Welcome to the first STARS webinar after our summer vacation. I am Tony Schönenberger. I'm the co-founder and the executive chairman of STARS. STARS webinars are interactive discussions about future-oriented topics such as geopolitics, technology, climate change, health, and leadership. A select group of people is attending this webinar live, and hundreds more watch STARS webinars later on as a recording. Today, we have the great pleasure to talk to Urs SCHOETTLI. Urs is a journalist, he's a writer, and a consultant based in Tokyo. Since the early 1990s, Urs has been reporting as NZZ correspondent from Delhi, from Hong Kong, from Beijing, and also from Tokyo. Urs also serves on the STARS International Board. We have now 30 minutes to discuss with Urs SCHOETTLI. I will take the privilege to ask the first couple of questions. If you have any questions for Urs SCHOETTLI, please use the Q&A feature below to type in your question. So let's go right into medias res. Urs, I have a first question. Afghanistan is a grave blow to America's standing, but it's only the symbol, actually, of American weakness. We are witnessing a geopolitical turning point, i.e. the end of the US being the world's policeman. We are seeing the end of the so-called Pax Americana. And no doubt the US is overstretched, as actually the British Empire was some time ago. So the question is, what are the geopolitical consequences? Is the slogan America first back again? Is isolationism back again?
Well, I think when we look at the situation today, we probably can see two events, two developments possible. One would be that with Afghanistan, the botched Afghanistan war was a Waterloo, and that, as you say, America first, we are forgetting about the world. Or the other option, which I think many newspapers, many media organizations, particularly in the West and in Europe, have not been looking at, it could be a turn for the better from the United States point of view. You must not forget, we had a comparison, 1975, Seoul, Saigon, when the Americans were fleeing from the embassy, and everybody compared it now to what happened in Kabul airport. But let's not forget, 1975 was Saigon. 1989 was the fall of the Berlin Wall, and America was the undisputed winner of the Cold War. So the second option is that the Americans use this new situation, as you mentioned, this overstretch, and say, let's focus on the things which are important for us. And important for us much more than some godforsaken Central Asian or country. An important thing for us is the Pacific Ocean and the rim states of the Pacific Oceans, both in terms of geopolitics, but also in terms of economics and finance. So you could see a strengthening of the focus of United States on East Asia, particularly on China. So I wouldn't be so triumphant if I would be Chinese. I would worry about what are the Americans now doing to pool their strength.
Next question would be, maybe we could focus a little bit on East Asia, where you are based. What is then the impact of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, etc., on East Asia? And perhaps you could tell us your opinion on Taiwan and on Japan and last but not least on South Korea too.
Yeah. Well, I'm now not commenting on the quality of the present president of the United States and whether he is really up to the job in terms of mental strength and so on. I'm commenting on the issue how people watch the implications, the long-term implications of this humiliation of the United States in Afghanistan. And what is quite a problem for Asia, and if you look from East Asia's point of view, the question is where, in case one of these crisis spots in East Asia turn into a real war, are the United States going to assist us? And I take two examples, very clear examples. One is Taiwan. Question in Taiwan is being asked, in case China attacks, are the United States coming to our rescue? Are the Americans ready to have thousands of people killed for the defense of another country? And the second is perspective from Japan. We have in the East China Sea, the Zuercher Islands or Senkaku Islands, which are disputed between Japan and China. And repeatedly there have been intrusions into the waters of the Senkaku Islands by Chinese ships into the airspace of the islands. So it's a tricky situation. There could be easily a clash, maybe unintended or maybe intended. And then the question is, do the United States, who are after all ally of Japan, do they come at the rescue of Japan, or do they say, well, these islands, the uninhabited islands in the East China Sea are of no importance for us, so why should we help? And the interesting thing is already under Donald Trump, there was serious doubt spread by Washington whether really United States will come to the rescue of Japan in case there is a Chinese attack on the Senkaku Islands. And last point, I mean, every foreign policy issue is also a domestic political issue. Now, if you're a nationalist in China, if you're a person who is strongly interested in history, you would tell President Xi, this is now the moment for you to achieve what is the dream of all Chinese, the reunification of the Chinese people. And we have always stated that this should be done with peaceful means, but if it's not possible with peaceful means, we can also use violence. And it's interesting, Xi Jinping in various speeches has mentioned the violent option. So you could advise him and say, look, if not now, when will we get this province back into China?
Are you actually expecting this before the next Congress of the Communist Party, meaning in October of next year, or will that be afterwards so that the pressure on Xi would be even bigger than before?
Well, I mean, in a way, we all must hope that on all sides, sensible people have the upper hand, because the problem, of course, is that if it's an open war around Taiwan, it will not be restricted to that area. It will have enormous economic impact. It may lead to uprisings inside China. I mean, this is not to be precluded. So I think, like it is always said, it's easy to start a war, but it's very difficult to terminate it or to put it into the correct direction. Now, at the moment, the Japanese are playing a very difficult game. They are, of course, complaining about the Chinese nationalism, the Chinese superpower aspirations. But on the other hand, they are very careful not to irritate the Chinese, because the China-Japanese trade is of enormous importance. And one last point, I mean, we always have been speaking, you and I, of the Asian century. And this is, of course, the Asian century, and it's also a very interesting phase. But a lot of people are also forgetting that in this Asian century, it's not only a century of economic opportunities, it's also a century of possible new wars and crises. I mean, in the Cold War, it was the North Atlantic, which was the sea of contention between the East and the West. Today, the seas of contention are the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean.
Realistically, actually, we should better speak of an American-Chinese century, which is the 21st century, and not the Asian century.
Yeah. I mean, the ideal situation would be if sensible people have the say is, I mean, China has economic muscle, has political muscle, has military muscle. It must correspondingly also behave as a responsible power. And it is without any doubt the strongest power in Asia. And this without any doubt, it's the hegemon of Asia. But as you said, it is not capable to really be present on the high sea and match the Americans. That will still take some time. So if we could get cooperation between United States and China and put emphasis on security. See, there's one other problem in Asia. That is, unlike Europe with NATO, we have no regional security architecture. And unlike in Europe, between France and Germany, the two enemies which have made peace, I mean, we haven't had such a reconciliation, for example, between China and Japan.
We could turn to other regions of the world. The impact of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, what is the impact maybe on Europe?
Well, I follow, of course, still the European media, and I'm always interested to see how much space and effort is spent on coronavirus. I mean, it's the most important issue, and people get upset about vaccination or non-vaccination and so on. And hardly anybody writes about the implications of what is happening or what has happened in South Asia. The most dangerous spot on earth, the most dangerous country on earth is not Afghanistan, it's Pakistan. The latest count, which I have access to in international security papers, the latest count is that Pakistan has 150 nuclear bombs. 150. And it is augmenting, according to these sources, by its arsenal by about 15 bombs a year. Now, we must pray to God that sensible people in Pakistan keep the keys to these bombs. Because there are two possibilities. One possibility is that there is a military putsch in Pakistan by lower ranking officers, some of whom are very fundamentalist Muslims. And these people make a putsch and get the keys to the atomic arsenal. And the second thing is if terrorists manage to make a break-in and steal some bombs, and then we have probably World War III, because this is considered to be the Islamic bomb. And they will at first launch it at the infidels. And the infidels are, of course, the most prominent infidels from them are the Israelis, the Jews, and then the Indians, and then Europe. And you can be assured that if Pakistan or from Pakistan territory nuclear bombs are being directed into the direction of the Middle East, Israel, World War will break out. So what I am astonished is that in Europe, some are even triumphant that the Americans had a defeat now. But I remember I discussed once at the security meeting of the ISS with an American, and he said, look, don't worry about these nuclear bombs. If there is the danger that they will be misused, we will take them out. Well, I mean, when you see that they haven't even been able to take out their nationals in Kabul, I'm not so confident that they are able to take out 150 nuclear bombs from Pakistan. So that is the first thing which I think the Europeans must realize. This is not a war in some part of a country, and it doesn't have to bother us. It can really get out of control pretty soon. Then the second thing is, now we are in an interesting situation. The Americans have left, but behind them are now in the region Iran as a neighbor, Pakistan, and a bit further away Turkey, a bit further away Russia, a bit further away China. And when you look at this, you have now, with the exception of India, which is not a direct neighbor, but in the vicinity, with the exception of India, all the powers which are interested in Afghanistan and in the turmoil in Central and South Asia are non-democratic regimes. So this is a very dangerous situation, and I think that we will have to watch very carefully what the implications are of what happened in Afghanistan for Central Asia. I mean, again, these are not very sympathetic countries if you think of Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, but they are vital for keeping a certain order in the region. And if that system breaks down, we have not the means to correct or to protect our interests in the region.
You know, the audience today is mainly from business, and therefore the question, you know, Joe Biden made it quite clear last night, I believe it was, that it's really the end of the Pax Americana, of lots of interventions in certain states to bring in the nation building kind of strategy. What does this really mean for the world economy, for global businesses?
Well, I mean, already COVID-19 has been a setback for globalization. I think that the main challenge is now in supply chain management. I had once the privilege to give lectures to students of supply chain management at ETH, and I was presenting the way the Japanese deal with supply chain management. And I like people who are supply chain managers. They are very pragmatic, very interested people. But one thing is very interesting, it's always astonished me. When you had the discussion about just-in-time delivery, global sourcing, never the question came up, what happens if the supply chain is disrupted? I was the kind of fool, the outside fool, who asked, have you planned? I mean, we have in Switzerland what was called Notvorrat. We had a kind of compulsory reserves which you needed to have in case World War III breaks out. But today, with this just-in-time delivery, hardly anybody has reserves sufficient. And I think that for the economic point of view, number one is the security of supply chains. I mean, you know as well as the other participants in STARS, when you stand on the top of this port authority in Singapore and you see the Straits of Malacca, you see the ships, the endless number of ships. I mean, who protects us there? And we had recently that incident with a tanker or with a container ship in the Suez Canal. So I think one conclusion from this, which has been accentuated by COVID-19, but also by now what happened in Afghanistan. One conclusion is in the future, supply chain security will be the main issue for us. Globalization in the old way is gone. That cannot be repaired because it's simply not possible for us to have the military means and the physical resources to check and protect all our supply chains for wherever they come.
If we look into the future, can you see a kind of a new world order? Will it be obviously a kind of a multipolar world? But the question obviously would then be, how safe will the world be in the future?
Well, I think there must be a rethinking now. I mean, I guess most people are now convinced that nation building is not possible. I mean, I was always skeptical when they said, you know, we must go into Afghanistan to build a nation. And in a country with 40 years of war, and we see it now on the pictures in the television, if you have a Kalashnikov, you are the big boss. I mean, try to tell these young men you should make go to university or work as a postal clerk. They will say, are you mad? I have a Kalashnikov, I can get what I want. So we are more and more having in the world a need for responsible, stable societies, whatever their political system, Not, it doesn't need to be a referendums democracy like Switzerland. It can be also an authoritarian regime. But we need to differentiate between countries that have more or less social peace and manage their affairs. Because what we have forgotten is that the history of mankind has always been, to a large extent, a battle between two kinds of civilization. One civilization is the predatory one. They invade other countries, they exploit other people, they rob what they want for their survival. And the other civilization is what we are used to. People save, they work hard, they educate their children, they build museums, all the aspects of high culture. And this is today, we battle between those who say, no, we are not foolish enough to work hard, we are taking it from the others. And blackmail will become a tool for many states, particularly if they are on the way of breakdowns, like you could have because of environmental catastrophes or social breakdown. So I think this is going to be the issue, not saying we have now to have a group of democracies or a group of non-democracies, but you should have the aspect of responsible governance and social stability.
Do we see making of another bin Laden out of Afghanistan, or the new regime realizes to have a civilized world?
I think that we have these areas which are not only in Afghanistan, they are also in Pakistan, which are under the control of terrorist movements. And I think we question what is the difference between ISIS and Taliban. Are we on good terms or on bad terms? I mean, these are all criminals, gangsters, vicious human beings, and occasionally they will unite if they can make a profit, and occasionally they'll kill each other. So I think that kind of second bin Laden is perfectly possible in this world. And you know, the situation is become so difficult to control everything with the movement of people that it's becoming ever more difficult for the civilized states to control what moves around the world in the dark world of the terrorists and criminals. And you must not forget, wherever there is large-scale terrorism and extortion, it's also in general an area where you have drugs. and that is, the main income which the rulers of Afghanistan have comes from the drugs. So as long as we don't solve this problem, we are not going to be able to avoid other terrorists, maybe not of the same charisma, but of the same viciousness like bin Laden.
I have another question from STARS alumnus Leon Malatsobu, the former ambassador of Kosovo in Tokyo. How do you see the positioning of other powers, China, Russia, Turkey, Pakistan, in the post-US Afghanistan? Which countries are to benefit and whom will the Taliban turn to for support primarily?
Well, the situation is complicated by various factors. One problem which we must not forget is that there are still borders which are not recognized or disputed. I mean, between Pakistan and Afghanistan, there is the so-called Durand line, it's not recognized. In fact, even the Taliban's latest news seem to tell the Pakistanis this is not recognized, this border for us. When there is a border area between Iran and Pakistan, which is called Balochistan, there are Balochi people on both sides of the border. And there are, of course, conflicting interests with Central Asia. So I think whether these so-called protection powers like Iran or Turkey or even Russia and China will be able to kind of stabilize the region. I think particularly China will be well advised not to start nation building in Afghanistan. And the interesting thing we have noticed is in recent times, quite a few bomb attacks in Pakistan have been, or attacks of knives have been directed against Chinese. It's not very comfortable to be a Chinese businessman driving in Karachi or in Quetta or in Gadwar, the harbor town of Balochistan. So I think we are having a phase now of breakdown of law and order in that region. And what I see is we, particularly the Europeans, don't have the will or the strength or the equipment to be a pacifying force in that region.
Don't forget that in Afghanistan there is a huge potential of resources, meaning particularly lithium, for instance.
Yeah.
I have another question from Peter Wiedel, who is the CEO and chairman of Waypoint Business Navigation. He asks, might the development in Afghanistan have an impact on migration policy of Western countries, e.g. sending back migrants with the mission to clean up at home?
Well, I mean, the people, I saw some discussions. There is a strong opinion that one should develop on location so that people don't need to migrate because migration causes social, ecological disasters, etc., etc. The question only is, do they have the necessary tools to do that? Now, for example, if you take Afghanistan, in the last 20 years, when the Americans were there, obviously in urban areas, particularly in Kabul, you could develop a middle class, you could develop people who are educated and are equally interested in stable life like we are. But it shows now the end of this phase of 20 years that there is no fundamentals for that in the country. And my question is, the we cannot guarantee that every human being will be able to fulfill its dreams and will have a prosperous life. So you have to think of what kind of development aid, development projects can be made to keep people reasonably comfortable in their life. And for example, one thing which I would stress, one tool, which it sounds now a bit provocative, but a peacemaking tool today would be professional education, Berufsbildung, to train people. I mean, what you see, all these young men, I mean, what have they learned when you see them now on the picture of the Taliban and so on? They know nothing. And it's to do with disrespect of the elites in most of these developing countries of professional education. You either go to university or you're nothing. But to be a good butcher, to be a good plasterer, to be a good painter, that is not an aspiration. So I think that our development projects in the future in fragile areas like Afghanistan should not be nation building, but society building. And society building means that these people get a goal in their life, an ambition, something which they can be proud of, because no human being wants to be a loser all his life.
We have two more questions, and then we are going to stop. First question is from Dominic van Planta. He is the COO of Schwind iTech Solutions and a STARS alumnus. And he comes back to one of your answers before. He says, I fully understand the mentioned challenge of supply chain resilience. Nevertheless, reserves cost money, and the difficulty is to evaluate which parts and how many of them need to be in stock. How would you tackle the challenge of regional supply chain risk versus costs to the business?
I mean, the interest must be to reduce the cost of the safety for supply chains. You will not be able to get total safety, but there must be a certain, and what I, for example, see is one should invest more in risk analysis. You see, particularly also with financial companies, I see when they look at risks in faraway cultures and civilizations, these risk assessments often do not take into consideration the real problems. I mean, they look at inflation rate, they look at growth rates and so on, but they don't look at soft factors of instability. So if you want to shore up your supply chains, you might have to make new assessments of risks. And for example, one element, short element, small element, is to look in history. There are countries which have experience with living with scant resources. And there are other countries which have never learned to live that. They live into the day, and correspondingly, they don't put up reserves and so on. So I think one key element, which is not a huge cost factor because data you can get from all over, but one key element of supply chain management in the future must be assessment of stability of societies. And if you know where the society is stable, obviously you can rely yourself more on need to make less reserves, but you can rely more on day-to-day business.
I would like to ask the final question to you, Urs. Urs, you are not only a journalist, you're also a writer, and I would say also a philosopher. And therefore, I would like to ask you, is the West as a concept, or maybe as a philosophy, with its values, its liberal democracy, the human rights, etc., is that coming to an end?
Well, I think the great challenge is to find out how this West, the so-called West, can survive in the new constellation of the world in the 21st century, in what we call maybe the Asian century. And I think, therefore, that it's not, I'm not going as a Westerner to give up the values we have been developing. I mean, the age of enlightenment, the Renaissance, etc. These are elements which are essential for our identity and which are valuable for all of mankind. Everybody can profit from Michelangelo and the French human rights and so on. But the other aspect is what the West should do is now to get down from its Eurocentrism. I mean, we must recognize what values are produced in Asia. And, you know, there are values which we have been forgetting or neglecting in recent times, like respect for the aged, or like respect for family, respect for clan, for getting together, duties. I mean, the whole concept. You just made me take now the debate on COVID-19. If you are out there in Asia, you find it extremely arrogant how these Europeans deal with this thing. I mean, they should be happy that they have now tools like vaccinations and can afford it to protect themselves. So if you look at it from a Vietnamese or a Thai, you find, I mean, these Westerners, they think they are the center of the world. So I believe it's not a question of giving up the concepts of freedoms, values we have. It's rather one of opening up and recognizing that, yes, there are different expressions of freedoms and there are different expressions of duties, but maybe we can also learn something from the Asians. It doesn't always have to be us who are the teachers. We can also be disciples.
Time is up, unfortunately. We have to come to an end, Urs. So first of all, I want to thank you very much for your brilliant insights and your analysis of, I would say, an ever more complex world. Urs will be speaking again in November, and particularly about the impact of the post-COVID world, particularly also what is happening in East Asia. Secondly, I want to inform you that we have a great pipeline of webinar speakers. One will be Tan Chong Meng. He is the Group CEO of PSA, that is the Port of Singapore you mentioned before, Urs, which is the largest transshipment hub in the world. And we have the pleasure to also welcome Marie-Astrid Langer, a STARS alumna. She is the NZZ correspondent based in California. And actually in 2 weeks from now, she is publishing a book, a biography on Kamala Harris. So that will be then the topic of that webinar. I hope to see you all there. In the meantime, take care, stay healthy, and thank you very much again for attending this webinar session. Goodbye. Thank you.